a set of learning objectives. So let's take a look at what's lined up for us today, starting off with evaluating the site survey as we look at exactly what the site survey means. We then look at discussing elements relating to the site survey, following that with identifying the tool set that you need to be able to conduct your very own site survey. We end that section off by conducting a site survey. From here, we jump into discussing concepts of dimension. And lastly, we construct our very own dimension line from our site survey. A very exciting lesson, a jam-packed one at that. So let's not waste any more time and get into the deep depths of this lesson. Here is the quote that I have lined up for you today. Precision is, after all, not only a form of responsibility and a kind of pleasure, but it's an instrument of compassion. To be precise requires care, time, and attention to the person, place, or process being described. This quote is going to stand you in good stead for this lesson as we build on the idea that precise surveys are going to provide grounding for your projects. A precise survey is equivalent to a precise project. And as you know, for every lesson, you need to grab a couple of things. Let's see what we have lined up for today. You need to grab your sketchbooks, a pen, pencil, and eraser, and lastly, your trusty tape measure. So if you don't have one of these already, I suggest you go out and grab one. You can get one from a local handyman store or your stationery shop. So as you know from your previous lesson, I've got about 5 with me at all times, but you only need to get one and make sure it's a nice heavy-duty long tape measure. Let's take a look at what you can expect for our lineup for today's lesson. We start off with topic 1, the site survey, knowing everything about the site survey. Following that with topic 2, showing us how to conduct a site survey. And lastly, our last topic for this lesson is adding dimensions. So we look at what the dimension line is, how to construct a dimension line, and how to add dimensions to our drawings. We begin with topic 1, the site survey, our first topic for today's lesson. If you can remember, we spoke in our last lesson quite a lot about the site survey. Can anyone tell me what the site survey actually is? Think back to lesson 1. How does the site survey work? How is it put together? You can pop your answers into your Morpheus text box or simply make a note for yourselves in your sketchbooks. Right, in order to understand what the site survey is, let's take a little look at a definition. Site surveys are detailed studies carried out to supplement and verify site information provided by the client and site appraisals carried out by the consultant team. A site survey is a simple 2D drawing of the space that you're trying to show, which includes all dimensions and features such as doors, windows, columns, electrical points, etc. A really good site survey will provide the foundation for our experts to begin developing our new layout and design. A site survey in simple terms means to inspect a site. So if someone is conducting a site survey or you're conducting a site survey, this simply means that you're going out to that site and gathering as much information as you possibly can about that project or site. The site survey is generally conducted by the designer or architect working on that project to gather the information relevant to their project in order to produce or carry out the design work. In the design and architecture industry, a site survey would typically be referred to as conducting the site survey or conducting your survey. A site survey can take from anywhere between 30 minutes right up to an entire day. The amount of time spent on your survey would be entirely dependent on the size and the amount of detail that is required on that project or site. Remember, you need to document as much information as you possibly can relating to that project. You want to include everything from the ceiling, wall heights, right up to plug locations and furniture placement, and maybe even plumbing and pipe work. The type of site survey and best practices required are totally dependent on the nature of the project and what your project entails. When we as designers carry out the survey of our projects, the idea and the main aim is to go onto the site of that specific project and extract as much information and detail about the project in reality as possible. Remember, at this point, your project completion is still a blink on the horizon. We need to look at what is currently in place of our proposed design, survey that space, and then design around that accordingly. So when conducting your site survey, some of the elements that you're wanting to consider when on site are the following. Firstly, orientation, the location of the project and the location of areas within that project. You then want to take a look at measurement and detail exactly what is there at that point in time. You then want to take a look at the access routes, how to access the space or area. And lastly, you want to note or take note of any obstacles that you may face during the design and building phases. Catch these issues early on in the project, note them down, and make sure that you can design around them. Now that we have a solid idea of what a site survey is, let's take a look at some of the reasons that a site survey are vital elements to your projects. As you know, and as I've just mentioned, the site survey is one of the most important aspects to any project. And this is particularly important in the planning phases of your project. Here's why. Firstly, your site survey will lay the foundation. The site survey is the starting point to any project. I cannot stress this enough. Without the site survey, you cannot begin to design anything. When designing without a site survey, this is called designing blind, and I never recommend this as a way to start off any project. The site survey will provide you the starting point of detail, notations, dimensions, and most importantly, a feeling for the space. Secondly, your site survey is important and vital in avoiding errors. Having a fresh and clean current site survey of your project is highly important before you start any work, as it is the starting block of your drawing and project work. All the information from your site survey is going to form the foundation of your drawing pack or your blueprint. Although existing site surveys might often be provided by the client or the building authorities or local municipality or council, you cannot be dependent or fully depend on this information. These drawings may contain errors, they may be old, they may have some sort of inaccuracy that will definitely cause problems later down the line on your project. This holds true for both a fresh site or an existing building for renovation, extension, or remodeling. Therefore, it is important to make sure that you are conducting your very own site surveys, or at the least cross-checking information that has been provided to you. And thirdly, the site survey is important as it provides vital information. A site survey provides accurate, current information about the site that you're working on and the site that you are currently standing on. The site survey will give you the best idea of the typography of the site, entry, exit points, obstacles that are in your way, resources that you might be able to use during the project planning or the project implementation stage, elements and exit and entry points, as well as neighboring developments, which I often find quite important. The survey will provide information about natural elements such as the sun and wind, which are vital factors when planning your project, planning entry points, planning openings, natural light points, etc. Having a better idea of what a site survey is and the importance and value it holds on our projects, let's take a look at when one would typically conduct a site survey. I'm going to ask you to think back to Module 1 where we looked at the project phase breakdown. Well, can anyone tell me where they think the site survey would come into play in your project timelines? Think back. Think about how you start off a project. Think about how we meet with the client, how we set up our briefs, how we then formed our schematic design. We then moved into concept phases. We then moved into building and construction, maintenance, and handover. In that timeline, when would you typically conduct your site surveys? Let's recap the project timeline. First, we had obtaining our brief. We then had schematic design. We then performed concept development, construction documentation, construction maintenance, and construction administration. A site survey, as you know, is a tool used to assess the site right at the beginning of our projects. You want to have spoken to the client before you conduct your site survey, obviously, to obtain an idea of what they're wanting and requiring from you as the design professional. From here, your next point of call is the site survey. So technically, you would do your site survey right at the beginning phase of schematic design. You would make an appointment with your client, explain to them your process relating to your site survey, and then go and conduct your site survey in person on that site. Here is a little scenario. Vanessa, your client from lesson 1, is now renovating her hair salon. She has already made contact with you and given you an idea and a brief and goals as to what she's wanting to achieve in that space. This has all been done over the telephone, so what do you do now? At this point, my first point of call is to arrange a meeting with the client, Vanessa, on that site. This will allow me to meet with Vanessa in person, in her environment, and get an idea of what she is wanting to see. It gives me great insight into that space. By doing this, I'm also able to get an idea of what restrictions we may be working with. Once I've had a meeting with my client, established a solid brief and signed our contract, I will then conduct my very first official site survey. Your site survey may typically begin with a very simple walkover. So you might walk onto site, assess the site with your eyes before actually conducting a formal site survey. From here, it will progress to a more detailed survey, focusing on specific detail and criteria within the project. And as you know, the site survey is generally carried out by the lead designer or a consultant that has been employed specifically to survey or survey sites. This would be your site surveying contractor. On your screen is an example of some of the site surveys that I have created and conducted over the years. Some of the key points to notice here are that they are very rough. The quicker I can gather the details, the more I can gather in a shorter space of time. They also incorporate a lot of detail, which is highly important. When I get back to my desk, I need to be able to clearly read and see everything that is visible to me in reality on that site. So I need to pretty much be the eyes in my sketchbook when I get back to my desk. And thirdly, as you can see, they are neat and clear. You need to be able to read what you've drawn up when you're back in the office, converting these drawings to CAD or your CAD programs. Our next topic that we're going to look at is the tools of the trade, a very important topic to consider when conducting your site survey. What tools do we need handy when we're on site? You are going to need a measuring tape. This could be in the form of a laser or a manual measuring tape. A long tape will make it much easier to measure longer lengths of windows and walls, and it'll help you be as accurate as possible when measuring. You're also going to need a pen and pencil in varied colors. This is only due to the fact that you might want to note different elements of that site survey in different colors so as not to confuse yourself. And lastly, and very importantly, you need a camera or some sort of photographic device. You want to photograph your site survey once you've done your sketch layout. Before we go any further, I want to show you and give you an idea of what you can expect after you've conducted your site survey. Once you've conducted your survey, you would typically convert your drawings, your sketch drawings, to a computer program, CAD, which is what's coming up in lesson 3. It's an exciting lesson as we look at CAD, what CAD is, and how it aids us on our interior design projects. I'm going to leave you with some homework, however. Go and find out what CAD means, as it's only going to help you answer some of the questions for your next lesson. Moving on to our next topic, how to go about conducting our site surveys. I get so excited just thinking about this, as I find it such a rewarding phase to any project. We get to stand in our proposed project space and visualize what is to come. We are going to start off with the base point, planning the site survey, the tips and tricks on how to create and set up your site survey. Here is a list of some of the tips when preparing to conduct your site survey. Firstly, allow sufficient time. Obviously, the size of the space plays a huge role in this, but I generally allow a minimum of 2 to 5 hours for all of my site surveys. This includes the travel time, the brief discussion with the client prior to conducting any measuring, as well as time allocated to measuring and detailing up that space. Secondly, you want to prepare before you conduct the site survey. Make sure that you know how to get to the site, how to access the space if the client is not going to be there, obviously. Before I conduct any site survey, I also make sure that I have all the relevant detail relating to that project printed beforehand. You may have an existing plan from the owner or landlord. Print that off and take that with you. You may have an email from the client on how to access that space. Print that off and take that with you as well. A handy tip, make sure your camera or iPhone is charged beforehand. It's really frustrating getting to the site and not being able to take any photographs, worrying about your phone or your phone's battery. Make sure that everything is charged beforehand. So in summary, print out all the documentation that you have on that site, take it with you. Plan and make sure you've got a map on how to get there so you don't get lost and you don't waste time. And make sure you've got a device that can take photographs that is pre-prepared or charged. Next, you want to make lists. I always do this. I prepare a list of elements that I want to take note of and use this as a checklist to make sure I don't forget anything. When you get on site, it's really easy to get caught up in the moment and forget exactly what you need to do. Some of these elements that I include are things like make sure I check the ceiling heights, notate the wall color, notate floor finishes, make sure I get a dimension of the distribution board, the water points, and the plumbing points. These are just some of them. We'll go through this in a little bit more detail towards the end of the lesson. Next, you want to take photographs. Photographs are never enough. You never have too many photographs. Make sure that you photograph every single detail of that site, as well as take full image shots. So try to get images showing the bigger picture as well as the smaller detailed elements. Remember, when you're back at your desk, you're going to rely on these images heavily. So you don't want to have to go back to site because you've forgotten to take enough detailed images or detailed visuals of the space. Once you've planned and prepared to conduct the survey, you are now on site and ready to start the survey. Here is a typical process that works really well for me and one that I recommend you use to test your first site survey run. Let's see what I've got lined up for you. Step 1 is your visual assessment. A site survey can be quite a time-consuming task and can use a lot of brain power and energy. So before I start doing anything, I simply stand in that space and manually assess what is happening in the current space just with my eyes. I listen and I look at each and every element in a holistic way. This is also a great technique to do to understand the walls and the space and how everything fits together, which is going to make step number 2 much easier. During your visual assessment, you're also going to want to assess how the space flows, how people function within the space, what tasks are being performed, how the light functions in the space, how is the space functioning and does it work? Step number 2, you want to start with a rough sketch. So here in this phase, I create a simple rough pencil or pen sketch in my sketchbooks of a floor plan view, as well as an elevation view or section view if I need it or if it's required. This is a very simple outline of how the space is put together. So remember, it's rough, it's quick, and it's neat. Step number 3, exciting, start measuring. This is the point that you're going to take out your tape measure, whether it be your laser or your manual tape, and go around the entire space measuring up each element and detail. You are then going to take your pen or pencil and note the measurements next to the corresponding elements on your sketch from step 2. For example, if I've measured the length of a wall from right to left, you're then going to add the exact dimension onto your wall on your sketch as a width from right to left. Go around the space systematically, working with your walls around the perimeter and then moving into the center. And I usually do this in a clockwise format so that I remember exactly what I'm doing. It's a systematic approach. I don't want to get lost or stuck while conducting these surveys. As you know, they can be time consuming. Step number 4, note all the detail. Step number 4 is to make sure that you're gathering and noting all the detail once you've added all your dimensions to the space. You want to note and create little mini sketches of any detail that you may have not picked up on your plan or your elevation view. Some of this detail may include how elements such as furniture fit together. You want to look at the material makeup of everything and make notes of this as well. It's important to add notes to each door indicating its use, entry point, the door swing, a main entrance or busy entry or exit points. From here, we have step 5 to photograph the space. There is a trick to this step. Having a file with loads of photographs when you get back to your office can be really confusing and daunting. The way to avoid this confusion is to have your systematic method. So I start with the entrance of the space. I always have one entrance shot. And then I start taking full landscape shots of the rest of the space. I work around the space from the left-hand side to the right-hand side in a clockwise direction. When taking digital images of your space, you need to make sure that you capture all parts of the interior. So photos can really help uncover any errors in the measuring process and help you as the designer see the condition and style of the furniture and the space that you are considering during your planning and designing process. And lastly, we have step 6. Double and triple check everything. You're going to be incredibly upset with yourself if you get back to your desk and you've not captured all the relevant detail. Some of the elements that you may want to check that you've got are things like your heights of ceiling, dimensions of furniture pieces, depths of furniture pieces, lengths and widths of walls, and other elements such as your window frames, furniture, lighting, electrical points, plumbing elements, and then your basic furniture details. Right, so once you've conducted your site survey, you may need to redraw the survey to make it a little bit clearer for the designer working on it or even for yourself. This can be done on site, or alternatively, you can take your sketch drawings back to your desk and draw it up neatly there. After your survey has been completed, the designer or you will draw up that space in your CAD program. If all the measurements work out, the design process can then start. If you find that you are missing measurements or missing elements of the survey, or something's unclear or correct, you will then need to go back to that site and rejig your site survey or reassess the site survey. So as you can see, it's incredibly important to double check on site that you have everything. So when you go back, you're not wasting time having to go back to the site again and remeasure everything. From here, we are going to take a look at some of the elements that you need to consider and include on your site survey. So in a side note or on a side note, there are so many elements which will vary from project to project. But here is a general guideline or checklist that I use when conducting my site survey, and then I alter it according to the project I'm working on. So starting off with our general list, you need to include a holistic view and include photographs of the site. You want to include as much of the project detail as you can. So any elements that you can't draw or that you're not capturing on your floor plan, you then want to recreate a little elevation or section including the detail of that. You want to include all of the structural elements that make up that project or building. Some of these elements might include your internal walls, external walls, ceiling, and floors. If you can, and if this information is available to you, you want to include a boundary line. Where can you build to? Where is that boundary line? So for example, in a retail scenario, the shop boundary line is the front or the entry point of that store in most cases. This you can often get from your landlord or the owner or even the architect who previously worked on that project. You want to make sure that you've noted down all your access points and the orientation of your project. So for a house, you might want to show the north, south, east, and west points in relation to that house. For a retail store, you want to show where your exit and entry points are and where your fire escape entrance and exit points are. Then let's take a look at the specifics list. You want to include specifics like electric, lighting, and data points, a very important aspect to look at and one that we often forget. You also want to include your plumbing and structural points, finishes such as floor finishes, wall finishes, etc. You want to allocate and note any decor and furniture items that sit within the space. And another one that we often forget and something that's very important, you want to include fire equipment, something that's often quite important for city planning. Then when it comes to your drawing, some of the drawings that you want to include in your site survey or when you're conducting your site survey is an elevation of each of the walls that are relating to your project, a section through the space and a section through elements that you are drawing up or working on in your project. Always the plan view, and often the plan view is the most easiest to create your site survey from. You want to include measurements on your drawing and then any notation. So this might lead back into your entry points, access points. You want to note your boundary line, structural elements. You might want to notate the different wall finishes. So maybe one wall is a brick wall and the other one is a drywall. That is something that you would notate specifically for the purposes of, on a drywall, you can't really hang things unless it's been reinforced. Whereas on a brick wall, you can hang elements that are quite heavy and don't need too much additional support. And there you have it, a general list of what to include or what to look out for when conducting your site survey. We are now going to put what we've just learned to the test as I show you how to go about setting up and starting your site survey for a very simple space. So I'm going to use my living room as an example, but obviously this can apply to any space. At this point, I have already prepared for my site survey with my checklist. I've printed it off. I've printed out the location. For me, it's quite easy because it's my living room. But for you, I would print off a plan or a map of where you're going. My checklist doesn't necessarily always have to be a printed one. Often I just note down some of the points in my sketchbook with little check boxes next to it and tick them off as I go along. I also have my tools with me, ready and waiting, my measuring tape, my sketchbook, and a couple of pens and pencils. So let's start off with step 1. I do my visual assessment. So a recap, I would stand in my space and visually assess what's going on around me. Step 2, I'd create a rough sketch of the space, noting any elements that I need to dimension or make notes of for my site survey. Step 3, I conduct my measurements. So I take my tape measure and I measure exactly what needs to be notated on my rough sketch. I then note any detail in the space. Step 5, I go about photographing the space. And step 6, I double check and triple check everything so that I don't need to come back to the space. We are now going to put what we've just learned about to the test as I show you exactly how to go about doing this, starting with step 1. Step 1, I'm starting off with my visual assessment. So I'm standing in my living room, taking everything in relating to the space. I'm looking at the noise, focusing on the noise around me. I'm thinking about the air and the traffic flow within the space. I'm looking at the people, the color of the space, the size of the space, etc. I'm also noting the shape of the space in my head, making the next step easier, the next process much easier, which is step 2. Step 2, I'm going to roughly draw the space plan, so a plan of the space. So I'm taking my pencil and I'm drawing a sketch floor plan. In my case, this is quite simple. It's just a rectangular shape, but I'm also going to roughly add where my doors and windows are, as well as some of the mobile furniture pieces. Step number 3 is to take measurements, or start taking measurements. Now that I've got my rough sketch outline of the space, I can take my measuring tape and measure each length, height, and depth. So once I've taken the measurements, I'm then going to notate them onto my rough sketch. Neatly, neatly, neatly. You have to be able to read this drawing for years to come. That needs to be sitting in the back of your mind. Step number 4. I'm now going to take note of any detail that I wasn't able to include on my floor plan. So now that we've added the basic dimensions, you need to notate the dimensions of the detail element. If you can't fit this all on one original sketch, so your floor plan sketch, you need to go and create side drawings. And with these, you need to make sure that they are labeled or have a symbol next to it that correlate with the floor plan so that you know exactly what you're drawing when you're back at your desk reading through your survey. From here, step number 5, I'm going to photograph the space. Once I've finished with my survey sketch, I'm going to systematically take photographs of everything. So remember, and this is my process, I start with the entrance point, so I know exactly what the entrance of my project looked like. And then obviously, this then kind of bookmarks the next project. And then, as you know, step number 6 is to make sure I've double checked and triple checked everything. I'm going to make sure I go through my checklist. Have I covered everything? I'm going to make sure that I've drawn my sketch correctly and I've notated all the corners and how each wall fits into the next correctly. So I'm going to make sure I'm conducting my survey once. From here, I've added some really amazing additional content to your summary notes relating to measurement, photographing your site surveys, and other elements to look out for when conducting your site survey. So please do pop on over there to check them out. They're going to be hugely beneficial when it comes to your final module assignments. Now that we've conducted our site survey, taken rough survey dimensions and measurements, we are going to need to add these to our professional or technical drawings. That brings us to our next topic for today's lesson, adding the dimensions. Can any of you tell me what a dimension is? Think about it for a second. Make a note in your sketchbooks or draw a little image. What is a dimension, or what is a dimension line? Let's take a look at a definition. A dimension is the visual elements that we as draftspeople, engineers, architects, interior designers use to indicate the measurement of a space or object. Both dimension and measurements are what is going to assist us in achieving accuracy on our drawings. After all, accuracy is key. We as designers will use our technical drawings to set up our drawing communication to our client and to our contracting teams. On these drawings, we use dimension lines to add the measurement value relevant to that section. So we're taking measurements from our surveys and adding it to our drawings in the form of our dimension. Dimension and measurement are vital, as we have learned, to every single technical drawing and every single project. In fact, they are the foundation to our drawings. Here's why. The purpose of a dimension line or dimensions on our technical drawings or our blueprints is to add detail about size to the object or space. A dimension is going to provide you only one possible interpretation of the information when the construction or manufacturing process comes about. On your screen is an example of an accurately dimensioned technical drawing of a little apartment space. We are looking at a plan view which has been accurately dimensioned. Here are some of the elements that I want you to notice. Firstly, clarity. Notice the clarity of information. We can clearly see exactly which dimensions relate to which wall or which section. Secondly, accuracy. Accuracy in the placement of the dimension. Each dimension line has been accurately placed in accordance with what it's being dimensioned. Each dimension line has also been placed really neatly with the same distance from each wall. And lastly, the completeness of information. Can you see? We can see each dimension of each wall. We can see each length, width, and depth. And this is typically what your dimension line is going to look like. In order for your dimensions to be accurate, clean, and precise, they should conform to the following standards. Firstly, your dimensions need to be correct. The value that is indicated at the top of the dimension line needs to be a correct numerical value for that space, so that measurement needs to be accurate. No thumbsuck figures or almost correct values, they need to be correct. Secondly, precision or precise placement. Clarity and precision is of utmost importance. Dimensions must be placed in the appropriate position in relation to what they are indicating measurement for. Then completeness. Nothing must be left out. Nothing must be duplicated and nothing must be left to the imagination. That dimension needs to be complete. And lastly, legibility. This is key. The appropriate line quality must be used for readability. So we must make sure that all of our lines are the same, all of the numerical values are the same font, same size, and at an appropriate size for the reader to be able to know exactly what dimension has been proposed for that line or that space or that area. Dimension and measurement are vital, as we've just learned, to every single technical drawing and project. In fact, they are the foundation to our drawings. Let's look at why. The purpose of a dimension line or a dimension on a technical drawing is to add detail about size to the object or space. A dimension will provide not only an interpretation, but only one possible interpretation of the information when construction comes into play, as we've just learned. The process that one needs to follow in adding dimension and measurement to your drawings is a very simple one. Let's look at how we go about doing that. In simple terms, you need to collect measurements or your site survey, make a note of the survey, and then import these measurements into your scale drawings and apply them to the correct location in the form of a dimension line. Here is your step-by-step guideline on how to do that. Step 1, conduct the site survey. So we've just looked at exactly what the site survey is and how to go about conducting one. That is your very first step, step 1. A site survey would be conducted to generate or provide you with measurements. If the space is non-existent, so it hasn't been constructed yet or isn't an existing space, then you as the draftsperson would conduct research into sizing and correct sizing of the elements that you are drawing up, and then use these dimensions as your starting point. However, if the space is existing, you would then go and conduct your site survey or request existing drawings or plans from the landlord. Step number 2, set up and create the drawing. Your technical drawing will need to be drawn up from this point based on your site survey. Let's, for argument's sake, say that you're drawing a table. All the lines of the table will be constructed on your plan, elevation, or section drawing. These drawings will then be created in CAD or manually using your scale ruler, and then printed or plotted for the viewer. Then step number 3, you need to add your dimensions to your drawing. Dimensions will be added in the correct location using your dimension line. We've gone into so much detail around the process flow of measurement, scale, and dimension. The next step we need to look at is what the dimension line looks like and how we construct and create a dimension line. Here is a list of some of the elements that I'd like you to focus on when setting up your dimensions on your drawing. Firstly, we need to focus on quantity. How many dimension lines have been added to that drawing? Every relevant element has to be dimensioned and has to have some form of dimension line. However, if there are too many, we need to create a separate drawing. Remember, legibility is key. Then you need to focus on the location of the dimension line, where the dimension has been added. They are generally all sitting on the outside of the drawing. You don't really want to have too many dimensions on the inside of the drawing. They must not be overlapping any text or any drawing elements. We don't want a messy drawing, remember? They need to be neatly set out on all of the external walls of the building, and I use approximately 1.5 centimeters from dimension to dimension, so the space lying between each dimension. A handy tip, they also must not clutter the drawing. Neatness is key here. Then we need to focus on consistency in size, font, color, placement, etc. Every dimension has been created or needs to be created with the same font, the same color, and the same size, and exactly the same distance away from each other. This is going to give your overall drawing a sense of neatness and clarity. By sticking to these rules, you're going to ensure 1, clarity of information, 2, accuracy in placement of dimension, and 3, completeness of information. The aim here is that the drawing needs to be clean and neat. Dimensions need to be located in a space where they cannot be confused with any other objects. So you don't want the contracting team reading the drawing confused or having to phone you with loads of answers or questions or inaccuracies. It could be important to remember to place the dimensions in a view or 1 or 2 drawings where they will be most easily understood. This is obviously to avoid error down the line. Now that we know dimension is the tool that we use to indicate measurement on our technical drawings, let's take a look at how to create dimensions by breaking down some of the elements that form a part of your dimension line. How do we construct our dimension? Right, so our dimension line or our dimension typically has 4 elements to it. It has the dimension line, it has extension lines, arrowheads, and numericals. Let's break those up into bite-sized pieces, starting off with our dimension line. The dimension line is the line drawn from edge to edge of the space that you are indicating a measurement for. This is done in a linear fashion. It is typically drawn by hand or by CAD as a fine, dark, solid line with a symbol such as an arrow or a strike mark on either side. So let's take a look at exactly what that looks like. Here is your linear line. And that is your dimension line. That is your numerical value. So the dimension line is the central linear line running from left to right in this case. Then we have our extension lines. These are the lines that intersect with the dimension line at each end. They are typically drawn as a fine, dark, solid line that extend outward from a point on the drawing to which the dimension refers to. Usually the dimension line meets the extension line at right angles, so it creates a right angle. Let's take a look at what that looks like. That's one of your extension lines, and that is the other. See how they cross the dimension line at a right angle and protrude right down to your drawing. And there you have it, the extension lines. Next, we have our arrowheads. Our arrowheads or strikes are located at each end of the dimension line or the leader line. They are used to indicate the end of the dimension, so the arrow needs to sit right at the end of that dimension line. Your arrows can also be substituted for a simple strike as well. It's totally dependent on the designer. These elements have the power to make a drawing look untidy and messy, so make sure it's neat and clean and consistent. To avoid this, keep your drawings simple and the style of the arrow or strike the same throughout the entire drawing. So this is what it would look like. Those are your arrowheads. There are typically 2 arrowheads or strike marks per dimension line. And lastly, we've got the dimension numericals. These are the numbers or values in units to indicate the size and measurement of that space. Typically, one would add these to the central point of the dimension line. So you could either add it between the 2 arrows with the space on your dimension line or just slightly above the dimension line. That is your typical dimension. And there you have your numerical value. I typically add it right above my dimension line as not to break the dimension line in the center. Let's see what those elements look like all together. Have a look on your screen as I show you how I typically create a dimension line and I add all of these elements to one drawing. Firstly, we are going to start by creating the dimension line. This is the linear line, in this case running from right to left. Next, I'm going to add my extension lines. This is showing the end of the dimension line or the ends of the space that I'm measuring or dimensioning. I'm going to add my arrowheads at this point. Remember, the tip of the arrowhead needs to come right in line with the end of the extension line. And lastly, I'm adding my dimensional numerical value. In this case, I've got 1,000 millimeters, which would be equivalent to 1 meter. Right, so now we're going to put the above concept together as we look at how to dimension a drawing by hand. In your AutoCAD lesson, we are going to take this information and use it to create our very own dimension line in CAD. However, remember, the fundamentals are learned by creating our drawings manually, so I'm going to show you how to create a manual dimension line by hand. Step 1, you're going to make sure that you've got your measurements handy. Which measurement are you adding to the space? And obviously this is taken from your site survey. Step number 2, you're going to select the area. Make sure you know exactly what area you're adding a dimension line to. Step 3, with your ruler, you're going to create your dimension line. So I usually work on about a 1.5 centimeter offset from the object or line that I'm creating the dimension for. No matter how far away you create your dimension line, you need to keep the distance consistent throughout the drawing. This adds neatness and overall consistency throughout the drawing. Step number 4, you're going to add your extension lines. Step number 5, you're going to add your arrowheads. So with your ruler, you're going to create your arrowheads or strike marks. Step 6, you're going to add your numerical values. Right, so let's see how that's done. I've already got my measurement, so step 1's covered because I've covered my site survey. As you can see, I'm starting with step 2, selecting the area. Step number 3, I'm going to add my dimension. With my ruler, I'm going to create my dimension line. I usually work, as I said, on about a 1.5 centimeter offset, which is exactly what I'm doing. Step number 4, I'm adding my extension lines with my ruler. So I'm navigating right to the beginning of the area that I'm dimensioning, making sure it lines up exactly, then proceeding to navigate to the other side of the line that I need to add the dimension for the space. And there you have it. Those are your extension lines. Now I'm going to add my arrowheads. With my ruler, I'm going to create my arrowheads or strike marks. I'm going to place the arrow right at the end of the element that I'm wanting to dimension. There you have it. That is your arrowhead. And now step number 6, I'm going to add the numerical value. So what is the space or the distance of that space? In this case, it's 1,000 millimeters, which again is equivalent to a meter. And there you have it. That is how you add a dimension line to a space. Right, guys, we've come to the end of this lesson. Like I said, a jam-packed lesson, but a really exciting one at that. Let's have a little look at what we've covered. We started off by tackling the site survey as we understood the value and the elements that make up a site survey. We then evaluated elements relating to the site survey and identified the tool set needed to conduct our site survey. Following on from this, we conducted our very own site survey of my living room. From here, we discussed the concept of dimension and finished off with constructing a dimension line. And that is a really nice recap leading us into our challenge. Your challenge today is a 2-part challenge. Firstly, I'd like you to create a site survey process flow and checklist template. So this you can do in a Word document, a bullet point form. Alternatively, you can jot your survey process down in your sketchbooks with little blocks next to it. Please make sure that you include all of the information that I've covered in this lesson, and if you can, include some additional research and information on your checklist, elements that you think are important when conducting a site survey. Make sure it's a really nice, solid checklist. Your second part is to go out and conduct a site survey of an office space. So it could be an office space that you're working in now. It could be a friend's office space. It might be your partner's office space or an office space in your very own home. Make sure you're following the process that we covered in this lesson. Make sure that you're preparing everything prior to conducting that survey. Take your checklist with you and make sure that you tick off everything in that checklist. Add the dimensions to your site survey. So remember, you're going to sketch out the little space by hand first. Add